Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to this wonderfully international and diverse audience today. Couldn't think of a more relevant topic to share, both right now in 2020, as we're all really engaging with distributed teams, as well as seeing just all the hellos in the Zoom chat from, I'm seeing Africa, Australia, around Asia, Europe, America. It's absolutely fantastic to see that we're all right now already collaborating across borders. So as Nick mentioned, I'm Adam Schuck. I'm from the Canva engineering team, and I'm based here in Sydney, Australia. And I'm going to talk through today about inclusive distributed teams and how to collaborate effectively across borders, which is really the topic of the day. Before we get into it, in the spirit of reconciliation, Canva acknowledges the traditional custodians of the country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea, and community. We pay our respect to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. A little bit about myself, as Nick mentioned, I'm the engineering lead on the marketing and engagement group at Canva. It's one of the larger groups at the business. I'm also part of the engineering leadership team. And I'm extremely passionate about building inclusive distributed teams. I've been on both sides of kind of the border and the ocean throughout my career, and we'll tell a little bit about my story as we go through today. So to cover, we're going to talk about the HQ way and things that I've seen in my career that have been done at growing businesses. Maybe you've seen at some of your nonprofits. Some principles for thinking about distributed teams, and then go over communication, the importance and role of communication in how to effectively collaborate, and some tactics. And then we'll save some time for Q&A, really hoping to have an engaging session. So let's kick it off. A little bit about myself. I'm based in Sydney, Australia, and love to tell the story of when I joined Google, which was about 15 years ago now. And I was the first engineering hire in the Google Sydney office. And the first team I worked on, fresh, new into my career, was spread between, it was Sydney, New York, and Hyderabad, India. And if anyone knows about those three places, that's a really a broad cross-section of time zones to have to work between. And at that stage in my career, so I'm an engineer by background, and my work was getting code on this new feature for Google Maps submitted. And I spent most of my week writing code and then sending it for code review, typically by someone who was on the other side of the planet, based in New York. And what would end up happening is we'd play these week-long code review ping pong games where I would write my code and then I would have to wait until I wake up the next morning to receive back, hey, that's really great, but maybe change this and that. And then I'd change it, and then I'd send it back for more code review. I'd wake up the next morning for another response from New York. Actually, could you change this name to that? Little tweaks, and just the days kept dragging on. And it took a really long time to get anything across the line between these really diverse time zones. And actually, like I was young, I was very early in my career, and the way I short-circuited that was by personally staying up till 6 a.m. And pulling really late nights. And my boss, who was the co-founder of Google Maps, would stay up till 3 a.m. just so he could give me approval in the same time zone as New Yorkers. And that's pretty crazy. And there's no way, now I'm a father, I've got a family. There's no way that I can stay up till 6 a.m. to get code review and get my work done. And the absolute punchline on that particular project was that ultimately, a year into the project was cancelled from headquarters. A decision was made in California in Google's headquarters, and nobody from the Sydney team or the Hyderabad team who worked on this thing was present in the room. So to me, these were like a few really interesting examples of, that struck me as an anti-pattern of how to do distributed teams. And I think this is quite early in Google's journey. Fast forward to another chapter of my career. I joined Twitter New York via acquisition of my startup. we started the New York engineering team back in 2011. So that's 9 years ago now. And this was really the first engineering team working on the core product for Twitter that was based outside of the San Francisco headquarters. There was London working on TweetTech, but we really were kicking it off. And over time, so I started as an engineer and over time became the engineering lead for that office, which grew to 80 engineers. But when we started, we were just sitting around one lunch table, a really exciting stage. So of course, what this meant was, it meant the New York engineering team was the first remote team. And that really required a lot of trailblazing. And the way that Twitter was set up at that point in time, there were a bunch of challenges that just made it very hard to get your job done. So being kind of outside that headquarters, the documentation wasn't great. So the way you would find out how to start a server, I remember when I visited San Francisco, I'd wheel my chair over to a colleague and say, hey, how do you do this? And he'd show me how he does it, because there wasn't enough documentation. I also remember one very challenging time I was invited to a meeting. I was the only person outside of the headquarters. I was 15 minutes into the meeting, messaging people, hey, is the meeting happening? No one had dialed into the telephone bridge. Half an hour emails, and ended up just going back to my desk. And then 15 minutes after the meeting, I got a few messages from people in San Francisco. Oh, we didn't realize there was a telephone bridge that we needed to dial into. And I just completely missed that meeting. So I think the world has learned a tremendous amount. Twitter has learned, Google has learned, we've all learned a tremendous amount since then. The other thing that I experienced at Twitter was similar to Google, decisions being made about the product direction, and maybe not including everyone from the relevant parties from different locations, but certainly sometimes they weren't communicated all the way. So it's really important to be on top of things. So for me, these were really eye-opening lessons. My goal in life was not, I want to move to a headquarters. I firmly believe that we should all be able to do the best work of our lives, have as much impact as possible without being constrained by our location. And absolutely, in 2020, we're all getting a real taste for remote work and distributed teams. And I'm sure a number of people on this call are experiencing that. So for me, the huge takeaway here was, for distributed teams to be effective, they need to be inclusive. And in that Google example, being present for product decisions and the ability to do in-person code review, it was only possible because we were located in the same place. And in my Twitter example, hallway chats, meetings, not needing documentation, being able to wheel your chair over to a colleague, this was only possible because the team was located all in the same place. So these companies were not yet set up to be inclusive of people that weren't physically present. So when I say inclusive, you've probably heard the word inclusion a lot. We talk about diversity and inclusion. I'll just reiterate a common definition of it. Inclusion is when every single person in the community is valued, heard, respected, empowered, and feels a true sense of belonging. I'm going to talk through today how to build that inclusive environment for your distributed team. When we talk about diversity and inclusion, it's very common when we're talking about that we're talking about gender, we're talking about race, we're talking about age, we're talking about sexuality, other aspects. I'm going to present to you why I really think that location is another axis of diversity and inclusion. It's something that we really need to be mindful of, be inclusive around, and really focus on that inclusion piece and how we can build those teams to be inclusive. A point on language. This is something that comes up every now and then, is the language of remote versus distributed. And so for any of you who happen to have a headquarters or like a kind of a critical mass in one location, but other people dialing in from other locations, on the left, you can see that this is a mentality of having the HQ and then remote workers. And that this immediately positions people, if we refer to people as remote workers, the remote team, it immediately positions them as the outsiders. And it positions these people as the people who have to go, they're the ones who have to do the work to get more included. Whereas I really encourage everyone to flip that mind, that mentality, and use language of distributed teams. And what that really means is putting us all on level footing. So even though I work at Canva in Sydney, and the majority of our employees are based in Sydney, I try not to think of myself as being in this kind of privileged set of people who work out of headquarters, or now I'm working from home in a privileged time zone, but rather for us to all have the mindset that we're all members of a distributed team. And what that means for us is that it encourages us to share that responsibility rather than having this dual tier of these two tiers of employees at our company. So with that, I might open up a question and see how well this works over Zoom chat. I'd love if any of you are facing some challenges with collaborating across borders. I'm seeing a lot of people in the comments saying that they're working across continents and people in really interesting places. Feel free to just throw in the Zoom chat some of the challenges that you're seeing, and I might just call a few of them out. I'm seeing time zones. Also, we will have time for Q&A at the end, so if you don't get a chance now. Time zones. That's 3 for time zones. Anyone have any other of the big challenges? Language barriers. Brainstorming. People not attending Zoom meetings. Language diction. Building relationships. All right, on that, this is really great. Keep them coming. There's COVID. Schedules. This is really great, and this is really helpful to help kind of guide some of what I'm going to talk about a bit later. So we'll move on. Feel free to keep jumping in and keep the conversation going as we go. So let's start by talking through some high-level principles that I'd really like to people to think about when you're thinking about collaborating across borders, when you're trying to build those inclusive distributed teams. So the first one is, if it's necessary for a distributed team, it's valuable for all teams. Another way of saying that is, we're all distributed teams, even if we're not think like a distributed team. Distributed forces process changes that would benefit any organization. It forces more explicit communication. And so in that example I gave earlier with Twitter, I found it hard to do my job in New York. It was actually impossible to do my job in New York because there was no documentation. But I would argue that documentation would have been valuable for everyone in the San Francisco headquarters because people on different floors would have had access to it. People would be able to find the answers to their questions without having to find the right person, without having to interrupt someone. So that's just one example. But in general, if something is necessary for a distributed team, it's still an incredibly valuable thing for all of us to do to make our company stronger. The second principle is around asynchronicity. Asynchronous practices reduce coupling and increase empowerment. I saw a lot of people mentioning time zones in the comments there. You know, until one day we somehow magically have everyone in one time zone, we really need to learn to work with each other without having to be online and available at the exact same time. And so when I talk about asynchronous practices, that's including culture, for example, how the team communicates with each other, and also processes. For example, how decisions are made. So at my last startup that I worked at before Canva, we, from scratch, reinvented our code review process to be asynchronous. And what that meant was features could be released and actually in customers' hands before someone had done the code review. It didn't mean that our code quality slipped. If anything, I think we were just as rigorous, and it forced more empowerment and more ownership on the author of the code's part. But it did mean that people weren't constantly blocking on each other. We really built that culture of empowering others to make progress while being asynchronous. And this is something that we're really trying to embrace at Canva. It's worked really well for us. When implemented well, asynchrony enables autonomy, which is key when teams are not co-located. And this requires strong communication practices as well as a high trust environment. And I'm going to go into details and tactics and all of these principles in the next section. And the third principle is you should think distributed from day one. Adopt distributed culture before you have a distributed team. That idea of, I'll just walk over and ask Sarah how I do something, you can't do that. That's an anti-pattern. It no longer works. And if you have an organization that is growing, these kind of walk over and ask someone patterns aren't going to scale anyway. So it's better to embrace that distributed culture from day one. So with that in mind, let's dive into the importance of communication and some tactics on how to approach some of these principles. In a non-distributed environment, lack of transparency can lead to misalignment, mistrust, and you'll often hear people say, oh, I wasn't included in the meeting. This is really exacerbated in a distributed team environment. And when it comes to decision making, not everyone needs to be involved in every decision. But that said, stakeholders need to know what was decided and why in order to do their job. The more information we can give to people, the more we empower them, the better that they're able to do their jobs. And a great way to develop that transparency and trust is by acting like a hive mind, getting your team to think that you're a hive mind. And this means a culture of sharing information by default. So when the whole team gets smart, when somebody in the team knows something, pushing that information out and everyone knows something. That makes the whole team smarter, better informed, and more aligned. How do we do that? Something that I talk about a lot is these three words: proactive, written communication. Proactive, really important. It's about getting that information out to people when you have it, not waiting to be asked. Written, if you say something to one person, you might find yourself having to say it 10 times again. You don't know who you've said it to. But if you put something in writing, you've got a resource that can be shared. It can be looked back at later in time. So by being proactive about sharing information and putting it in writing, that's a really great way to get that hive mind and just getting everyone on the same page by default. Some things to think about in that proactive written communication. One, I already talked about documentation. Having great guides and how-tos and how to get your job done to help. That's especially important for new people starting in your organization. Decision notes, when you make a decision. So at Canva, we make lots of decisions about, actually, we're going to build this feature or we're going to launch this tomorrow. Sharing that decision, just capturing, writing that down. And we use Slack as our instant messaging tool at work. Just writing that down, making sure that everyone in the team sees it. Meeting notes, making sure that every time you have a meeting, someone takes notes and share those notes out. We don't need everyone to be in every meeting, but people do want visibility and to understand and have the context they need. The fourth one, Slack ups. I'm not sure how many people have heard about Slack ups. Perhaps you've heard of stand-ups, but the idea here is that stand-ups are very common in software engineering and agile processes. And stand-ups, usually you get the whole team together, you stand in a circle and everyone shares, what did I get done yesterday? What am I getting done today? And what am I blocked on? And that link is really great and helps keep the team, keep their finger on the pulse. However, that's really challenging if you have no time zone overlap or very different time zone overlap. And so something that we do a lot of at Canva is Slack ups, where we actually asynchronously have a reminder every morning at a fixed time every 24 hours, please give your update. And people will file in and reply in a thread with those exact same three answers. But it means that people can share it in their time zone and still stay on top of updates from other people. And just some two more thoughts on this one is share the why. I think it's in a distributed environment, it's so important to over communicate and make sure that people aren't just being told what to do and going off and not understanding what they're doing, but really share the thinking behind what you're conveying, so that people have as much information as possible to make decisions. And again, I've talked about writing is greater than saying. That's really valuable. Also, another note, as your organization grows, so one thing you might be thinking is, well, hang on, now you're telling me, Adam, that we should just write everything down and push out information. How am I going to keep up with all this information and inbox overload and all this information being pointed in my direction? And yes, as your organization grows, you can't read everything. So really my encouragement here is to push the onus back onto the writer. The writer needs to take care and value the audience's time and assist the reader to process that information. So for example, something we do a lot of is in long emails that we send out to Canva, including a TLDR, too long didn't read, one-line summary at the top of the email. You know, if you live in this office, you can stop reading now, or for everyone who uses this piece of software, you need to update it. So that when they read the whole email, they already know, does it apply to me? Is there going to be action required? And then highlighting things in your messages, making your message extra concise, just putting that extra thought into the message that you're sending. And it's all about their valuing each other's time. So on that, I got some screenshots of some examples of how we do this in Slack at Canva. You'll see in the top left, one of the teams here has set up a daily reminder at 9 a.m. To reply with what they did yesterday, today, and blockers. And so that just keeps that team's finger on the pulse. And that team was able to cut out their video stand-up entirely because they're getting enough information here. And you'll see a few other examples here. In the top right, our template design team do amazing visual work. They decided to do Slack shares every now and then of, hey, here's the amazing work we're doing. And they push out screenshots of all the brilliant new designs coming into Canva. And just capturing at the bottom there, Alice capturing a decision that was shared. So that's proactive written communication. Moving on to some tactics. Now that we've talked about communication, how can we apply this? So one really important thing is that even though I'm talking about asynchronous interactions, we still need to have meetings. Often you need to actually just figure something out or share context really quickly. It's really important that we have effective distributed meetings. And I already mentioned before in my story of being the unwitting participant in New York where nobody dialed me into a meeting. So really just making sure that everyone's inclusive and mindful. So the key here is when you're running meetings, really think about, are your meetings inclusive? Some things to think about. We've talked about time zones a lot. Check the times of all your participants and try and be as accommodating as possible. If you happen to be in a office-based company, which is, I'm guessing, a lot less common right now than it was 6 months ago, but making sure that you've booked meeting rooms for everyone involved. Have you shared the video link? Have you beforehand shared an agenda so everyone can prepare and knows what's being talked about? Do you have, if you're using some shared tools that you're going to collaborate on during the meeting, does everyone have access to it? Have you shared that ahead of time? And then shared notes. It's really important that when you're running meetings, making sure you have a clear facilitator, also a clear note taker. And that way those notes can be collaborated on during the meeting in real time, but also shared with anyone who perhaps wasn't in a flexible time zone, who wasn't able to make the meeting for other reasons beyond time zones, such as, maybe they're sick, maybe they're on family care, maybe they're on holiday. So really valuable, just capturing any of those decisions, etc. Some examples, we use a lot of different tools. We're increasingly using Canva as a real-time collaboration tool where everyone throws their ideas in to brainstorm together. There's a lot of great tools out there. I certainly encourage people to give it a go with Canva, the real-time collaboration. Also, we use Trello, Google Spreadsheets, other things like that. And everyone can follow along on their own screen and interact rather than necessarily having to watch on the screen share. And another point about those inclusive meetings, if you happen to work from an environment with lots of meeting rooms, this is something that we talked about at Canva, especially as we have been going in and out of the office. We're all currently working from home now, but a month ago, some people in Sydney were working from the office. And we just wanted to highlight that in that distributed team environment, to be really mindful of how those meetings are run. And so on the left here, you can see this is what one camera in a meeting room with, it looks like 5 people dialed in are doing. And on the right, we can see Gerald, and he's got his own screen. And so we ask, which of these is more inclusive? And I'd say that in this environment, you'd much rather be dialed into a meeting with Gerald on the right because he's got his own tile, so we can read his body language. We can see nonverbal cues. And that picture on the left, it's hard for me to even tell you who's in the room, let alone who's talking. They might be further away from the microphone. And I think when everyone is in their own tile and on the same footing, it leads to a much more inclusive and equitable meeting. So this is something we told everyone at Canva to do, is to be like Gerald and dial in from their own space, even if half of the team on that meeting is in the office that day. We've had people dialing in from rooms sitting right next to each other, just to really make those meetings as inclusive as possible. All right, another tactic that I'd love to share with some of you is always on video conference. So what's the thinking here? This is about reducing the barrier for starting a conversation across offices. On that theme of inclusion, when we're thinking, how do we make our distributed team inclusive? It's really about reducing the barriers to access. And so having this always on video link makes it really easy for people to just get into that conversation rather than holding back because they can't see other people. It also makes it much easier to gauge when people are busy. Maybe they got the headphones on. This is something we did in my last company, where we just, it was in Sydney and San Francisco, and we had the video link open 24/7. So when you're in the office, you could see the people on the other side. And it really made this company that was split across 2 continents feel like we were sitting in one much larger room than either of our offices. And it allowed for quick Q&A. Like, I would be able to just wheel my chair over to the video unit and say, hey, Jeremy, why did we use this library instead of that? And other kind of unstructured chats. The one occasion that was really a highlight for me is that one day somebody in Sydney sneezed and someone in San Francisco said, bless you. And so it really showed that we were really starting to feel like one team in one room. It started to feel odd when the video unit was disconnected, even if we just left it on in the background and no one was talking. So that might be an idea to try out in some of your distributed teams. We found that really helpful. And a third tactic, I've talked a lot about how to push things into writing for the status updates. I think the flip side of that is really connecting with your team as humans. So when you have those meetings, don't just have meetings where the conversation is transactional, status updates. Really use that time when you've got the video link, when you've got the microphone on, to connect with each other as people. That's especially important when you're working with people from different cultures and different backgrounds. So instead of just jumping in right, here's the topics, actually taking the time to find out what people's personal situations are. For example, yesterday on a meeting with people in Manila and Sydney, the how COVID is being treated right now is very different. And some people have challenging family situations. We're all humans, we're not just employees. So maybe you yourself are going through something. So empathy and compassion go a really, really long way. I also had a meeting just yesterday where we started it with, I led a couple of minutes of mindfulness where we all just closed our eyes and did some breathing. We found that really helpful just to, because we lose some of that human connection when we're not in the office together. So if you can, focus your synchronous video chat time on the human element. That maybe lets you move the status updates to asynchronous and written over some of the techniques that I mentioned before. And on top of that, another one is really do check in individually, check in one-on-one with other people, and make sure that you're not just interacting with people as words in a messaging client. Make sure that people are going well. So you'll see here on the right here, some examples in the top right. We've got one of the teams at Canva. They were all dialed in. I think they had a fancy dress meeting where they just got on the Zoom together and had a bit of a party together. It looks like a lot of fun. And the bottom right, some of our teams have been playing games and finding, instead of just beers on a Friday afternoon, which is, you can't do that over Zoom, finding online video games and party games to play that have been really great for helping other teams. I can see Nina in the comments written, we've got a 30-minute social catch-up for everyone. You're not allowed to talk work, and that's recommended. Couldn't agree more. I've seen a bunch of teams at Canva doing that. It's really important to just block out time and think about those human connections. Finally, fourth tactic is how to overcome communication challenges. So while hopefully a lot of the tips that I've already given you should help you avoid hitting those communication challenges in the first place, sometimes you just need to detect when you've hit an issue and really pull yourself out of it. When we're working remotely, the challenges require us to be extra thoughtful and planful in order to achieve our goals as effectively as when we were in the office. So just a lot of the points that I've talked about today so far have been really about having that mindset of thoughtfulness, of empathy, of thinking about the experience of everyone that you're working with and how their experience participating in your team might differ to yours and what you need to do to accommodate that. So one really simple tip that we use Zoom and we use Slack at Canva. And so we encourage people that when they're in a chat over Slack and maybe they're not understanding each other on instant messaging, rather than trying to figure it out and talking past each other, to be mindful of that mode of communication. So sometimes chat is the best tool, sometimes email is the best tool, but sometimes just having a phone call or a video call is the best thing to do to really rapidly get some body language, to get more nonverbal cues. And so for us, we're able to type /Zoom into Slack, like, hey, shall we just chat? /Zoom, bang, and now we're having a video chat with each other very quickly. It's the kind of the virtual equivalent of let's just quickly jump in a room. So that's another thing, is to always think about, like, am I using the right medium for the message? And two common pitfalls, two common traps are, one, information falling between the cracks. And the other side of that is interpreting the wrong intent from messages. On that first one, information falling through the cracks, detecting, oh, hang on, someone doesn't have context, really just trying to push out that context. Hopefully you've done a lot of, some of the previous tips are about capturing meeting notes, using online tools where people can see documentation, project status, so that people don't need to ask when they know what they don't know or don't know what they don't know. Rather, you have information and pushing it out. So hopefully you can get ahead of that, but if not, just detect it and share that information as quickly as you can. And then when it comes to interpreting the wrong intent for messages, I think it's so easy to talk past each other, especially if we're doing an instant messaging. So I think one thing there is having those deep relationships as humans. Because we're connected as humans, we're more likely to understand where someone's coming from. Maybe, we have extremely diverse cultural set of employees at Canva from all sorts of backgrounds in different countries who speak different languages. Some people very inferential in their language, some people more direct. It's really important to understand the humans that you're dealing with, how they communicate, and adapt your communication style. And seek to understand, assume positive intent, and really just try and get to the bottom of any of these intent rather than assuming negative intent. So it's just some questions to think about when we're communicating, just some real quick questions like, do we have the right people in the loop? Should we be casting a wider net? Are there people that need to be informed, even if they're not in the meeting itself? Are you valuing your audience's time? Can your message be misinterpreted? So again, not just when you're misinterpreting someone else, but also before you send a message, be thoughtful on how it could be misunderstood, and maybe just edit it a little bit to be bulletproof. I read an interesting article saying that the letter K, if someone replies K, some people can interpret that as passive aggressive, like it means okay, but is it like okay, or is it okay? Like the tone doesn't come through in these messages, and so don't just write one letter messages. Don't write short messages that are open to interpretation. And then, is this the best medium? Are we chatting on the best medium with each other? And can you assume positive intent from other people that you're interacting with? So to wrap it up, hopefully I've given you some really great principles, shared my story, and then given you some useful tips. To close, If you leave this call, please remember, think inclusive. How do you make your distributed team as inclusive as possible? And how do you take action, not just expect everyone else to? How can you empower that team using asynchrony? How can we connect as humans and really deeply understand the humans that we're working with rather than just having transactional interactions? And remember to level up your communications and avoid falling into the common pitfalls. And with that, we'll pass over to do Q&A. Thanks, everyone.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Adam. That was amazing. It was such a good presentation. I think everyone got a lot out of that. There's a lot of love going on in the chat, and I've got a few questions. So hopefully you can stick around and answer some of these for us. So the first one is from Lindsay. She's actually asking in your slides there, you used a game as an example for human connection. She wants to know what it was.
I think that one was called Jackbox. There's actually quite a few of these, and I think if you do a search online for online games, there's more answers today than there were 6 months ago. So that Jackbox one has all sorts of like board games. I think there's another one. Maybe you remember, Nick, that we done at Canva a trivia game. Our team in Manila has weekly trivia, which is really fun.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, we have lots of different games. I think all of our teams have their own way of trying to bond over Zoom and different fun games to play. So yeah, no, that's a really good one. Yep. So I've got another question here from Cecilia. So she's asking, if it's the first time you have a community and you don't have many followers yet, how do you go about bonding with each other?
Yeah, I think, so maybe part of that is like, how do we break the ice with people that we really haven't met and we don't have the opportunity to meet in person? I think some of the ideas here of just opening up some of these different communication channels. So I think that connect as humans slide that I had, if you can open up to having Zoom calls where people can just dial in, you can do what do we call them, like virtual coffees, where you could just just publish a Zoom link to a call and people can just come in and out and just say hello and bond with each other. I think there's a lot of great icebreaker exercises on the internet, fun games like getting to know you challenges. I'm trying to think of some fun ones we've done at Canva. We've definitely done scavenger hunts at home, where people need to bring some item that's important to them at home and then tell a story about it. I personally, my little baby daughter shows up in a bunch of my Zoom calls, which is a great way to break the ice and have people learn a little bit more about me. So yeah, I think just some of those connection ideas, hopefully that helps.
Yeah, I think that's really good. Really good advice for sure. Just noticing in the chat, Nicole says they have a no camera day to try and help with meeting fatigue.
Brilliant.
I know it can be a little bit hard going from meeting to meeting, so that's an interesting one.
What a wonderful idea.
I've got another question here from Nina. She would love to hear a bit more about how you have implemented asynchrony.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a lot of different ways to go there. I think the key point is to just think about the processes and practices and just in how your team operates and just rethink them through the lens of does this need to be synchronous? Does this need to be a meeting? What information are people blocking on? Something that we, the common expression is like seek forgiveness, not permission. And so I think the first part to achieving asynchrony is to really invest in and develop a high trust culture. That's not an easy thing to do, but that's a critical prerequisite for asynchrony, which is if we're going to be empowering people to make decisions, that maybe they'll do it differently to how you do it while you're asleep, but we want them to be able to make those decisions. We need an environment where people are trusted. We also need an environment where people are informed. And so they have all the context. They understand what is the policy? How do we think about this type of decision? And then I think that just the third piece for the asynchrony is then, so like once, assuming that you've managed to build that culture where people have all the information they need, and are trusted to make those decisions, and are told, like, these are, you are empowered to make decisions, then just take a real critical lens on all of the processes, and how you communicate as a business. And so some examples at Canva, we used to have our company-wide all hands. We call it we called it the stand-up. Now we call it the sit-down. It used to be, if you missed it, if you weren't in the building at the time it happened, you missed all the information. Now we share the video afterwards. We have notes from a lot of those meetings go out, and that means that people who aren't in the same time zone can now catch up. So that's like one process. I think I mentioned the other example of a previous company I worked at with the code review process. Instead of taking a process that made sense for people being in the one room, we took a real critical eye to it of what would it mean to have a code review process where we don't need to be in the same time zone, and we just rebuilt that from the ground up. And so we ended up with this, similar to what I said before, where all the engineers in the team had the context, they had the trust. I would finish my workday at 6 p.m. in Sydney. I would write up notes on how far I got on my incomplete feature. I would say like, oh, this is working, but I still need to do this. I'd publish that in our chat. And then I would wake up the next morning to find out that not only had my colleague in San Francisco taken my work, finished the feature, but it was already being used by customers. And so I think like having the context, having the trust, also having the empowerment that everyone has more power to make decisions, to like access to certain tools. Hopefully that's helpful.
Yeah, that's great. I think that's super helpful. And I've just got one more question here before we wrap up. Adam, have you got any ideas for an efficient validation process for a distributed team?
An efficient validation process. So hopefully I'm understanding that question correctly. By that I mean, is the distributed team working? How are we operating?
Yeah, I think so. There's another question here. It kind of links to that first part, which is about the unspoken rule of the final word. So, obviously the results of your communications, how does that communication confirmed and documented?
Right. Okay. So I think making sure that you have been heard and that communication has been reached. It's really about building that strong asynchronous culture where people acknowledge communication. And so something that I really like to see, and I think Slack does this well, other tools I'm sure do this well too, is just finding lightweight ways to acknowledge that you've received a message. And so, if I post out, hey team, we all need to finish this research and development grant application by Friday, if I send out that message and everyone replies with a thumbs up, that way I know, like we've developed etiquette where, so people know like a green tick or a thumbs up means got it. Lots of like vote asking questions. I think that's another one, is just following up, quick polls, quick questions like, hey, any questions? Did this work? Thumbs up, thumbs down. And if people aren't responding, following that up. Also really building a good culture of people engaging rather than just your messages just flying one direction. And then I think in terms of like understanding, is it working? And like, how well are we doing as a distributed team? I think there's the quantitative and the qualitative approaches. Really important, I think extra important in a distributed team to keep your finger on the pulse of how everyone's doing. So, for example, Canva, we've done several, work from home surveys, asking questions ranging from general happiness, productivity, through to, support. Do you have the support you need and the resources and the people? And then, separate to that kind of survey information, just checking in with people, keeping your finger on the pulse by not just waiting for things to blow up, but rather being very proactive about checking in with people.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I think you're right. I love doing emoji polls in Slack. I think is a great way to make sure that communication is two-way and not just one way. All right. Well, I think we might leave it there. Thank you so much, Adam. That was an awesome talk. And I hope you guys got a lot out of that. I'm sure it's very, very important and useful information in the current work from home world. So thanks for joining us. And we've got another session coming up in a few minutes if you guys are sticking around for that. That is on social media marketing with Ben. So thanks again. And we'll be posting this recording soon. Thank you, Adam.
Thanks, everyone.